The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the Galactic Defense Academy. Hundreds of alien cadets stood in perfect rows, their different forms creating a strange rainbow of colors and shapes. There were tall blue Altarians with their smooth skin gleaming in the light. Massive Gorvak warriors towered above everyone else, their rocky skin looking like living mountains. The crystal-like Nethek people sparkled as they moved, while the snake-like Valari swayed gently in place. Among all these impressive beings stood one small figure that looked completely out of place. Hana Kim was barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style. Her uniform was the same as everyone else, but on her small frame it seemed to hang loose. She had quiet brown eyes that watched everything around her without showing any emotion. The other cadets whispered to each other in their different languages. Some pointed at her when they thought she was not looking. A few laughed quietly behind their hands. To them, she looked like a child who had wandered into the wrong place. The Galactic Defense Academy was not a place for the weak. It was the most famous military school in 7-star sectors. Only the best of the best were allowed to train here. Most cadets came from important families or were already famous warriors from their homeworlds. Some were born with special abilities that made them perfect soldiers. What was a small human doing here among all these giants and warriors? Drill instructor Vextar stepped onto the platform in front of the formation. He was a Saurid, one of the lizard-like people who had been conquering other worlds for thousands of years. His scales were dark green with scars running across them like white lightning. Each scar told a story of battle and victory. His yellow eyes were cold and sharp like a predator studying its prey. Vextar was 8 feet tall and built like a living weapon. His uniform was covered with medals and honor marks. He had trained thousands of cadets over the years, and he took great pleasure in finding their weaknesses and breaking them down. Only the strongest would survive his training. "Listen to me, meat," Vextar's voice boomed across the silent formation. His words carried the authority of someone who had killed enemies with his bare hands. "You think you are special because you made it here. You think you are warriors because someone told you so." He walked slowly along the front row, his claws clicking against the metal deck. "You are wrong. This academy will show you what you really are. Most of you will fail in the first month. The rest will wish they had never come here." The cadets stood perfectly still, but Hana could sense their fear. She had seen that fear before, in the eyes of soldiers who had never faced real danger. These young aliens had lived comfortable lives on peaceful worlds. They had no idea what war really meant. Vextar continued his slow walk until his golden eyes found Hana. A cruel smile spread across his reptilian face, showing rows of sharp teeth. Here was his first victim of the day. The small human would serve as a perfect example to break the spirit of the others. "You there," he pointed one clawed finger directly at her. "The tiny human. Step forward." Hana moved without hesitation. Her boots made sharp clicking sounds as she walked to stand directly in front of the massive instructor. She looked up at him without showing any fear, though the top of her head barely reached his chest. "State your name and your combat history," Vextar commanded. His voice was full of mockery. He expected her to stammer and embarrass herself in front of everyone. "Cadet Hana Kim, sir. Serial number 7749 Delta 9, she replied in a steady voice. "I did not ask for your number, whelp." Vextar leaned down until his face was close to hers. "I asked for your combat history. Tell us all about the great battles you have fought. Tell us about the enemies you have defeated." The sarcasm in his words was thick enough to cut. Several cadets behind Hana snickered quietly. They were enjoying watching the small human get humiliated. It made them feel better about their own fears. Hana stood silent for a long moment. Her dark eyes seemed to be looking at something far away, something only she could see. The silence stretched on until some of the cadets began to shift uncomfortably. Then, without saying a word, Hana reached up and began to roll back the sleeve of her left arm. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But as more of her arm was revealed, a thin white line became visible. It started at her wrist and ran up toward her elbow, jagged and irregular like lightning frozen in skin. But that was just the beginning. As Hana continued to push back her sleeve, more marks appeared. Burn scars that could only come from energy weapons. Small round marks that looked like bullet wounds. Strange patterns that some of the alien cadets recognized as acid burns from Zephyrian weapons. The snickering stopped. The whispers died away. Even Vextar's cruel smile began to fade as he realized what he was seeing. These were not training accidents or ceremonial marks. These were battle scars, real ones, the kind that came from actual combat where people died and blood was spilled. Hana rolled up her other sleeve, revealing even more marks. Some scars were old and faded white. Others looked more recent, still pink against her skin. There were bite marks that could only have come from alien predators. Surgical scars where field medics had worked to save her life. The formation of cadets was completely silent now. Even the instructors who had been watching from the side were staring in shock. In all their years of training elite warriors, they had never seen anything like this. "Where did you serve?" Vextar asked. His voice had changed completely. The mockery was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and growing respect. "The Outer Rim conflict, sir," Hana replied in the same steady tone. "The siege of Kepler Station. The Battle of the Scorched Worlds. The defense of Colony 77. The effect of those names on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. Several cadets actually stepped backward. Others made sounds of disbelief in their native languages. Even the instructors exchanged shocked glances. Everyone in the galaxy knew those battle names. They were disasters, not victories. Entire fleets had been destroyed in those conflicts. Whole armies had been wiped out. The casualty reports from those battles were so terrible that most worlds classified them as state secrets. A blue-skinned Altarian cadet named Jiho found his voice first. "Those battles, everyone died. They were complete defeats." Hana looked at him with those quiet eyes. "Not everyone died." The simple words hit the formation like a physical blow. Here was someone who had not just survived the most terrible defeats in recent military history, but had lived through all of them. She had been there when the plasma cannons turned entire divisions into vapor. She had walked through battlefields covered with the bodies of her friends. Vextar began to circle around Hana slowly, studying her like he would study a dangerous weapon. His predatory instincts were telling him that this small human was far more dangerous than she appeared. "How many tours of duty?" he asked. 17, sir." The number fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. 17 tours in the Outer Rim was impossible. Most soldiers were considered veterans after 3 tours. Anyone who survived 5 tours was regarded as incredibly lucky. 17 tours meant she had spent years in the most dangerous war zones in the galaxy. 17 tours, Vextar repeated slowly. "And you are here at the Academy because..." For the first time since stepping forward, something flickered across Hana's calm face. It was there for just a moment, but several people saw it. It looked like sadness mixed with determination. "Because the war is coming here, sir," she said quietly. "To the core worlds. To the safe places. And when it arrives, these cadets will need to know how to survive it." Her words sent a chill through the formation. The core worlds were supposed to be safe. They were protected by massive fleets and defense systems. War was something that happened to other people in distant places. But looking at this scarred woman who had survived the impossible, they began to understand that safety was just an illusion. War was coming and none of them were ready for it. Vextar stared at Hana for a long moment. Then he stepped back and addressed the entire formation. "Class dismissed. Report to your barracks and prepare for tomorrow's training." His voice was different now, more serious. "It seems we have much work to do." As the cadets began to file away, many of them kept looking back at Hana. The small human who had seemed so out of place now stood like a mountain among them. Her scars had spoken louder than any words could. Have the drill instructor had asked about her combat history. She had let the scars tell the story, and now everyone knew that the real war was just beginning. The barracks were unusually quiet that evening. Usually the new cadets would be talking loudly, bragging about their home worlds or making jokes to hide their nervousness. Tonight was different. Everyone sat on their beds in silence, stealing glances at the small human who had changed everything that morning. Hana sat on her narrow bunk near the window, cleaning her issued plasma rifle with practiced movements. Her hands moved without her having to look, taking apart each piece, checking for wear and putting it back together. She had done this thousands of times before in places where a dirty weapon meant death. The other cadets watched her work. There was something mesmerizing about the way she handled the weapon. It was not just familiarity. It was the kind of deep knowledge that came from depending on that rifle to stay alive. Jiho, the blue-skinned Altarian, finally gathered enough courage to approach her bunk. His people were known for their curiosity, but even he felt nervous walking over to the legendary human. "Hana," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Those scars you showed us today, the battles you mentioned, are the stories about them really true? She did not look up from her weapon. Her hands continued their steady work while she considered his question. Which stories? The ones about Kepler Station. They say that when the Ravager army surrounded the base, one human soldier held them off for 3 whole days. That she fought alone against thousands of enemies while the civilians escaped. Hannah's hands paused for just a moment, then continued working. Stories get bigger every time someone tells them. But something like that happened? Something like that. More cadets began to gather around, drawn by the conversation. Minho, a young human engineering student, sat down on a nearby bunk. What about Colony 77? The report said everyone was dead. The rescue ships found nothing but empty buildings. The reports were wrong, Hannah said simply. But how do you know? This time Hannah did look up. Her dark eyes met his, and there was something in them that made Minho wish he had not asked. Because I was the one who walked through those empty buildings. I was the one who found the survivors hiding in the underground tunnels. I was the one who brought them out. The weight of her words settled over the group. They were not just hearing about history. They were talking to someone who had lived through it, who had been there when entire worlds burned. Tay, a proud Nalori warrior, leaned forward. His people were famous throughout the galaxy for their strength and honor. The Battle of the Scorched Worlds. That was where the great Admiral Corran made his famous last stand. Admiral Corran was a good man, Hannah said quietly. He died in the first hour. The first hour? But the battle lasted for days. The Admiral believed in honor. He believed in fighting fair and following the rules of war. Hannah set down her rifle and looked around at all the young faces watching her. The Ravagers do not care about honor. They care about winning. She stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the academy grounds. In the distance, the lights of the capital city sparkled like stars. It looked peaceful and safe, but Hannah knew how quickly that could change. What really happened? Asked Somin, a communications specialist from Earth. Hannah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft they had to strain to hear her. The Admiral formed up his ships in traditional battle formation. He sent a formal challenge to the enemy commander, asking for honorable combat. He gave them time to prepare their own formation. She touched the glass with one finger. The Ravagers used that time to surround us. But surely your ships fought back. We fought. We fought as hard as we could. But we were fighting the battle they wanted us to fight, not the battle we needed to fight. She turned back to face them. Half our fleet was destroyed in the first 10 minutes. The Admiral's flagship exploded with him still on the bridge, trying to coordinate a proper response. The cadets listened in horrified silence as she continued. That was when the rest of us stopped following orders and started trying to survive. We broke formation. We used asteroids for cover. We fired on ships that were retreating. We did everything our training said was wrong. Her voice got even quieter. And some of us lived. How many survived? Shiho asked. Out of 60,000 ships, maybe 300 made it out. The number hit them like a physical blow. 60,000 ships meant millions of people. Families, friends, entire crews who had trusted in their training and their leaders. And almost all of them had died because they fought with honor against an enemy who had none. Yunbi, a strategic planning cadet from Corellia, shook her head. But that goes against everything we learn here. Military doctrine exists because it works. Proper formation and tactics save lives. They save lives when both sides follow the same rules, Hannah replied. When you are fighting someone who cheats, who lies, who uses your own honor against you, then following the rules just gets you killed faster. She walked back to her bunk and picked up her rifle again. The instructors here are good people. They will teach you how to be proper soldiers. But the enemy we are going to face is not interested in proper anything. They want to win, and they will do whatever it takes. Then how do we fight them? Tay asked. His warrior pride was struggling with what he was hearing. You learn to cheat better than they do. You learn to be more ruthless than they are. You learn to survive when everything you thought you knew about fighting turns out to be wrong. Hannah looked around at all their young faces. And you learn to live with what you have to do to win. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. These young cadets had come to the academy thinking they would learn to be heroes. Instead, they were discovering that survival might require them to become something much darker. Minho spoke up hesitantly. The scars on your arms. There are so many of them. How do you keep going after being hurt that much? Each scar teaches you something, Hana said, rolling up her sleeve again. This one taught me not to trust a surrendering enemy. This one taught me that energy shields do not stop everything. This one taught me that sometimes you have to sacrifice part of yourself to save the rest. She pointed to a particularly ugly mark on her forearm. This one taught me that the mission is more important than the person carrying it out. Were you afraid? Soman asked quietly. Every single day. Fear keeps you alive if you listen to it, but you cannot let it stop you from doing what needs to be done. As the lights dimmed for sleep time, the cadets slowly returned to their own bunks, but none of them would sleep easily that night. They had learned that the war they were training for was nothing like they had imagined, and tomorrow their real education would begin. The training simulation chamber was the size of a small city. Advanced holographic projectors could create any environment imaginable, from alien jungles to deep space battles. Today, the chamber showed a war-torn urban landscape with burning buildings and rubble-filled streets. Drill instructor Vexitar stood before the assembled cadets, his scaled face showing satisfaction. This was his favorite part of training. The simulation would separate the real warriors from the pretenders. Your mission is simple, he announced. Hostile forces have occupied this city. Civilians are trapped in the central district. You must rescue them while minimizing your own casualties. You have standard equipment and 4 hours to complete the objective. The cadets were divided into teams of 8. Most teams quickly huddled together to plan their approach. They spread out tactical maps, discussed formation strategies, and assigned roles based on their training. Hana's team was different. While the others planned, she stood quietly at the edge of the group, studying the simulated cityscape through the viewing window. Her team members waited nervously for her to give orders or outline a strategy. Instead, when the simulation began, Hana simply walked toward the city entrance. Her teammates looked at each other in confusion, then hurried to follow her. Hana, what's the plan? Asked Minho, the engineering cadet. Stay alive. Save the civilians. Get out, she replied without stopping. But we need tactics. We need to coordinate our approach. Hana paused and looked back at him. Tactics assume you know what the enemy is going to do. In real combat, the enemy does not read your tactical manual. She pointed to where another team was advancing in perfect formation, just like their textbooks taught them. Watch what happens to them. Before Minho could ask what she meant, simulated enemy fire erupted from multiple buildings. The advancing team immediately sought cover and began returning fire in disciplined volleys. It was exactly what they had been trained to do. It was also exactly what the enemy AI expected them to do. Hidden weapon systems activated, catching the team in a crossfire. Within minutes, half of them were marked as casualties by the simulation computers. They are following doctrine, observed Te, the Nalori warrior. Doctrine is predictable, Hana said. Predictable gets you killed. She began moving again, but not toward the main streets where the other teams were advancing. Instead, she headed for what looked like a damaged drainage canal. Her team followed reluctantly, splashing through dirty water and squeezing through narrow tunnels. This is not the fastest route, protested Yunbi, the strategic planning cadet. Fast routes are watched routes, Hana replied. They emerged from the drainage system 3 blocks behind enemy lines, while the other teams were fighting their way through prepared defenses. Hana's team found themselves in an area the enemy had not expected anyone to reach. Contact left, Minho called out, as simulated enemies appeared from a building, but Hana was already moving. She did not dive for cover like their training taught them. Instead, she used the movement of her dive to roll behind a wrecked vehicle, came up firing, and immediately moved again before the enemy could target her new position. Her return fire was not the suppressing volleys they had learned in class. Each shot was precise, aimed, and deadly. The simulated enemies fell quickly, their AI unable to predict her constantly changing position. How did she do that? Chiho whispered to Somin. She is not fighting where they expect her to fight, Somin whispered back. The team pressed deeper into enemy territory. Every time they encountered opposition, Hana dealt with it in ways that seemed to break the laws of physics. She used shadows that should not have provided cover. She found angles of approach that appeared impossible. She made shots that the training simulations said could not be made. The enemy AI is adapting, Yunbi reported, watching her tactical scanner. It is changing its patterns to counter our movements. Good, Hana said, checking her weapon. That means it is learning to fight me. But I am already fighting differently than I was 5 minutes ago. She was right. Every engagement was completely different from the last. Where she had used stealth before, now she used aggression. Where she had been patient, now she moved with lightning speed. The AI kept adapting to counter her previous tactics, but she had already moved on to something new. Within 30 minutes, they had reached the civilian shelter. Other teams were still fighting through the outer defensive lines, following proper military procedure and taking heavy casualties. How do we get them out? Mino asked, looking at the 50 simulated civilians huddled in the basement of a partially collapsed building. The same way we got in underground, but the tunnels are too narrow. For that many people, Hana pulled out a small demolition charge from her equipment pack. Then we make them wider. Wait, Tay protested. That could bring down the building. The building is already coming down. Look at the structural damage. She pointed to cracks in the walls that were slowly spreading. We have maybe 20 minutes before it collapses on its own. She placed the charge carefully and guided the civilians into the drainage system. The controlled explosion opened up a wider passage just as the building above began to crumble. As they led the rescued civilians back through the underground route, they could hear the sounds of battle above them. The other teams were still fighting their way through enemy positions, trying to reach objectives that Hana's team had already completed. Simulation complete, announced the computer voice. Objective achieved in 37 minutes with 0 casualties. The holographic city faded away, revealing the amazed faces of instructors and cadets. Vextar stood in stunned silence, staring at the tactical display that showed Hana's impossible performance. Run it again, he ordered. Different scenario. The second simulation was a space station assault. Hana's team was supposed to fight their way through multiple defensive checkpoints to reach a central computer core. Instead, she found a maintenance shaft that bypassed most of the defenses and accessed the core from an unguarded service entrance. The third scenario was jungle warfare. While other teams got bogged down in the thick vegetation, fighting against hidden enemies and dangerous wildlife, Hana's team moved like ghosts through the forest, striking targets and disappearing before the enemy could respond. The fourth simulation was zero-gravity combat aboard an enemy vessel. Traditional tactics were useless in the weightless environment, but Hana adapted instantly, using the three-dimensional nature of the battlefield to attack from angles that the enemy could not defend against. Each time, the result was the same. Objectives completed in record time with minimal casualties. The AI systems, designed to provide realistic resistance, kept trying to adapt to her methods, but Hana fought like water, flowing around obstacles and finding weaknesses that should not have existed. How? Vextar finally asked when the fourth simulation ended. How do you do things that should be impossible? Hana holstered her weapon and looked around at the gathering of instructors and cadets. I do not fight the battle they want me to fight. I fight the battle I need to fight. But there are rules. There are proper procedures. Rules exist to create order in chaos. But when you are facing an enemy that thrives in chaos, following rules just makes you an easier target. She walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back. The Ravagers are coming. When they get here, they will not follow our rules. They will not fight fair. They will use every dirty trick and ruthless tactic they can think of. Her voice carried the weight of terrible experience. And if we want to survive, we will have to learn to be just as ruthless as they are. As she left the simulation chamber, the assembled cadets and instructors remained silent. They had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. Tomorrow, they would start learning how to fight a war where the only rule was survival. And their teacher would be a small human woman whose scars told stories of impossible victories against overwhelming odds. 3 weeks into their training, the academy felt like a different place. Word had spread about the human cadet who fought impossible battles and won them. Even cadets from other classes would find excuses to walk past Hana in the hallways, hoping to catch a glimpse of the living legend. But Hana herself remained unchanged. She trained hard, studied quietly, and spoke only when necessary. The attention made her uncomfortable, though she never showed it. She had not come here to be famous. She had come here because a war was coming, and these young aliens needed to learn how to survive it. The change was most obvious in her teammates. Jiho moved differently now, always aware of his surroundings. Minho had stopped relying entirely on his technical training and started thinking creatively about problems. Even Tay, proud of his warrior heritage, had begun questioning the honor-bound traditions he had grown up with. It was during one of their evening discussions in the common area that the real stories began to come out. Several cadets from different classes had gathered around, sharing tales of their homeworlds and families. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost like a family gathering. Tay was describing the ritual combats of his people when he made a comment that changed everything. We, Nalori, have never lost a single combat duel in our recorded history, he said with obvious pride. Our warriors are trained from birth to fight with perfect technique and absolute honor. Hana looked up from the tactical manual she was reading. The comment seemed to have caught her attention in a way that few things did. Honor duels are clean, she said quietly. Real fighting is not. You speak as if you know the difference between the two. Something flickered across Hana's face, there and gone so quickly that most people missed it. But Sumin, sitting nearby, saw the pain that briefly showed in her eyes. At the Battle of Scorched Worlds, Honor got 12,000 good soldiers killed in the first hour, Hana said, setting down her manual. The enemy did not care about fighting fair or following the rules of war. They only cared about winning. The casual way she mentioned 12,000 deaths made the room go completely silent. That was not a number from a history book. That was a personal memory, something she had witnessed with her own eyes. What happened? Asked Yunbi, her voice barely above a whisper. Hana stared at something only she could see, her hands gripping the manual so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Admiral Corrin was a good man. He had studied every great battle in galactic history. He knew proper military doctrine better than anyone alive. She paused, as if the words were difficult to say. He believed that if we fought with honor and courage, we would inspire our troops to victory. And the Ravagers let us form up in perfect battle lines. They gave us time to organize our formations and coordinate our approach. They even returned our formal challenges with messages of respect. Hana's voice became flat, emotionless. Then they activated hidden plasma mines that had been placed throughout the asteroid field where we were fighting. Minho made a sound of horror. They used your honor against you. 30 seconds. That is how long it took for our entire front line to disappear. Ships, crews, everything. Gone in a flash of superheated plasma. She looked around at the circle of young faces. I was on a supply ship in the rear formation. I watched it all happen. But some ships survived, Jiho said, more as a hope than a statement. Some of us did. After we watched our friends and comrades die because we followed the rules, we stopped caring about proper military procedure. We started fighting to survive instead of fighting to win glory. She stood up and walked to the large window that showed the stars beyond the academy. We used the wreckage of our own ships as weapons. We rammed enemy vessels with damaged cruisers. We fired on ships that were trying to surrender, because we had learned that Ravager surrenders were traps. That goes against the laws of war, protested Yunbi. The laws of war only work when both sides follow them. When you are fighting an enemy that sees your honor as weakness to exploit, following those laws just gets more people killed. Tay leaned forward, struggling with what he was hearing. But without honor, what separates us from the monsters we fight? The monsters we fight do not care about that question, Hana replied. They care about conquering worlds and enslaving populations. If being slightly less honorable than them means saving billions of innocent lives, then that is a price worth paying. She turned back to face the group. At Colony 77, I learned what happens when you try to be honorable with an enemy that has no honor. What happened there? Soman asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. The colony had 40,000 people, families, children, elderly people who had never hurt anyone in their lives. When the Ravagers attacked, our fleet tried to evacuate them using proper procedures. We formed defensive lines to protect the transport ships. We followed evacuation protocols that had been developed over centuries. Her voice got quieter, forcing them to lean in to hear her. The Ravagers targeted the transport ships first. They knew we would not fire back if it meant risking civilian casualties, so they used our own people as shields while they destroyed our warships one by one. But you saved some of them, Minho said, remembering her earlier words. After our fleet was destroyed, I was part of a small ground team that was supposed to confirm that everyone was dead. We found empty buildings, just like the report said. But I kept looking. She sat back down, her hands steady despite the terrible memories she was sharing. I found them 3 days later. 2,000 survivors hiding in the underground mining tunnels. They had been there for weeks, too afraid to come out. Why did they not signal for help? Because the Ravagers had used our own communication frequencies. to lure other survivors into traps. The people in the tunnels had listened to their friends and families being tortured over the radio, begging for rescue that never came. The room was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the Academy system seemed muted. "How did you get them out?" Tay asked. "By breaking every rule in the book. I stole an enemy transport ship. I killed the crew while they slept, which is considered dishonorable by most military codes. I used their own uniforms to disguise the survivors during the escape." She looked directly at Tay. "And I slept well that night, knowing that 2,000 people were alive because I was willing to give up my honor to save them." Jiho shook his head in amazement. 17 tours of that? How did you keep going?" "Because every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that the alternative was letting more people die." She picked up her manual again, signaling that the conversation was over. "The Ravagers are coming here now, to the core worlds, to places that have never seen real war, and when they arrive they will use the same tactics against us." "What can we do?" asked Sumin. "Learn to fight the way they fight. Learn to be as ruthless as they are. Learn to win by any means necessary." She opened her manual and began reading again. "Because the only thing worse than becoming a monster is letting the real monsters win." As the cadets slowly returned to their own studies, the weight of her words settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had come to the academy thinking they would learn to be heroes. Instead, they were learning that sometimes heroes had to do terrible things to protect the people they loved. And their teacher was a small human woman who had already paid that price 17 times over. The final examination at the Galactic Defense Academy was known throughout the galaxy simply as the Crucible. It was 7 days of continuous simulation designed to push cadets beyond their breaking points. Most classes lost a quarter of their students to medical withdrawals, psychological breakdowns, or simple failure to adapt. The simulation chamber had been expanded to cover an entire artificial world. Holographic projectors created a hostile planet with changing weather, dangerous terrain, and an enemy force controlled by the most advanced military AI in the galaxy. No communication with instructors was allowed. No predetermined objectives were given. The cadets had to survive, adapt, and find their own way to victory. Drill instructor Vextar stood in the observation center, watching the preparation with unusual intensity. He had personally redesigned this year's Crucible after witnessing Hana's impossible performances in the training simulations. He wanted to see what would happen when she faced odds that even she could not overcome. "The AI has been programmed with tactical data from actual Ravager engagements," he explained to the other instructors. "It will learn from every encounter, adapting and escalating its responses. Traditional military tactics will only make it stronger." The scenario began simply enough. The cadets' transport ship was shot down over a hostile world. They had basic survival gear, standard weapons, and the clothes on their backs. Their only mission was to survive long enough to make contact with friendly forces. Within the first hour, it became clear that this was no ordinary exercise. The enemy AI was different from anything they had faced before. It did not follow predictable patterns or respond in expected ways. When teams tried standard evasion tactics, the AI anticipated their moves and cut off their escape routes. When they attempted to establish defensive positions, it flanked them from impossible directions. By the end of the first day, half the cadets were struggling just to find food and shelter. The AI was learning their patterns, predicting their needs, and systematically denying them the resources they required to survive. Hana gathered the survivors around a small fire in a hidden cave. They looked exhausted, defeated, and scared. These were the elite cadets of the galaxy's finest military academy, and they were being hunted like animals by an enemy they could not understand. "This is not like the training simulations," gasped Yunbi. "Her strategic training useless against an opponent that broke all the rules." "No, it is not," Hana agreed quietly. "This is like real combat. But how do we fight something that learns from everything we do?" Hana poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks fly up into the darkness. "We stop thinking like academy cadets. We start thinking like prey." "I do not understand," said Tay. "Prey does not fight fair. It cannot afford to. It uses every trick, every advantage, no matter how small or dishonorable." She looked around at their confused faces. "We are going to teach this AI something new." "What?" "That humans do not give up. Ever. What followed was unlike anything the observing instructors had ever seen. Instead of trying to fight the AI directly, Hana led her team in a campaign of chaos and unpredictability that defied every principle of military science. They used broken equipment in ways it was never designed for. They turned environmental hazards into weapons. They fought with a creativity that no programming could anticipate, because it was based on desperation rather than doctrine. When the AI expected them to seek shelter from a storm, they used the lightning as cover for an assault on its sensor network. When it predicted they would avoid dangerous wildlife, they tamed the creatures and used them as scouts. When it calculated that they would run from overwhelming force, they instead attacked with such reckless aggression that its tactical algorithms crashed trying to process their behavior. They are not following any recognizable military pattern, reported one of the simulation technicians. The AI keeps trying to adapt, but their tactics change faster than it can learn. Vextar watched in fascination as Hana's team turned the tables on their pursuers. She is not trying to defeat the AI, she is trying to confuse it. Is that even possible? Watch and learn. On the fourth day, something unprecedented happened. The AI began repeating previous tactics instead of developing new ones. It had reached the limits of its adaptive programming and was starting to fall back on patterns the cadets had already learned to counter. It is learning our lessons, Hana observed with grim satisfaction. But we have already moved beyond them. Her team was no longer just surviving. They were hunting. They had turned a desperate flight from superior forces into an active campaign to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. They sabotaged supply lines that did not exist, disrupted communication networks that were purely electronic, and spread fear among artificial intelligences that were not supposed to feel emotion. By the sixth day, the AI was in full retreat. It had been programmed to escalate its responses indefinitely, but Hana's team had found the logical flaws in its decision trees and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. Simulation parameters are breaking down, announced the chief technician. The AI is requesting permission to reset to baseline programming. Denied, Vextar said firmly. Let it finish. On the final day, Hana's team achieved something that was supposed to be impossible. They not only completed the survival objectives, but actually forced the enemy AI into a defensive posture. Instead of being hunted, they became the hunters. When the 7 days ended, the simulation shut down to reveal a group of cadets who looked nothing like the frightened students who had entered. They were harder, tougher, and infinitely more dangerous. They had learned to fight without rules, to survive without hope, and to win against impossible odds. In the observation center, the instructors sat in stunned silence. No class in the Academy's history had not only passed the crucible, but actually turned it into a victory. How? Asked one of the younger instructors. Vextar studied the tactical readouts with something approaching reverence. She taught them to fight like humans instead of like soldiers. What is the difference? Soldiers follow orders and execute plans. Humans survive. He turned away from the displays and looked at his fellow instructors. And survival is not about honor or glory or proper procedure. It is about refusing to quit when everything else tells you to give up. But when he looked for Hana among the celebrating cadets, he found her standing apart from the group. Her expression was not triumphant but deeply troubled. Why do you look sad? Vextar asked her privately. You have just achieved the impossible. Because this was just practice, she replied quietly. The real enemy is still coming. And when they arrive, the stakes will not be graduation scores or training records. What will they be? Hana looked out through the observation window at the stars beyond the Academy. The survival of every peaceful world in the galaxy, including this one. Her words carried a weight that made Vexatar's scales crawl. He had trained thousands of warriors over the decades, but none of them had ever made him feel the kind of cold fear that was spreading through his chest now. Are we ready? He asked. We are better prepared than we were 7 days ago. But ready? She shook her head slowly. No one is ever ready for what is coming. As the cadets filed out of the simulation chamber, their laughter and celebration echoed through the corridors. But those who listened carefully could hear something else beneath the joy, the sound of warriors being born from the ashes of innocence, and the quiet determination of a small human woman who had already seen too much war, preparing to see more. 3 days before graduation, the emergency alarms began screaming throughout the Academy. Cadets rushed from their barracks as red warning lights flashed in every corridor. In the command center, massive displays showed long-range sensor readings that made seasoned instructors pale with fear. The Ravager invasion fleet was on the move. Thousands of ships moving in perfect formation toward the core worlds. Their destination was clear, their intent unmistakable. The war that had ravaged the Outer Rim for years was finally coming to the heart of galactic civilization. Admiral Daewon Kazuki, commandant of the Academy, stood before the assembled staff and senior cadets. His weathered face showed the strain of someone who had spent the last 72 hours coordinating with defense fleets across 7 sectors. All leave is canceled. All training programs are accelerated to immediate completion. Every cadet who can hold a weapon is being fast-tracked to active duty. His voice carried the authority of decades in command, but Hana could hear the underlying fear. The core worlds have not seen real war in 3 generations. Our people are not prepared for what is coming. The assembled cadets listened in stunned silence. Most of them had expected to spend months more in training before facing actual combat. Now they were being told they would be in battle within days. "Cadet Kim," Admiral Kazuki called out. "Report to the front." Hana stepped forward, her expression calm despite the chaos around her. She had been expecting this moment since the day she arrived at the Academy. The Defense Council has reviewed your performance record. They have also studied classified reports from the Outer Rim conflicts. The Admiral's eyes held a mixture of respect and desperate hope. "We need someone who can teach our forces how to fight an enemy that does not follow our rules." "With respect, sir, teaching takes time we do not have, which is why you will not be teaching." Admiral Kazuki activated a holographic display showing the approaching invasion fleet. "You will be demonstrating." The plan was both simple and audacious. Instead of trying to retrain the entire galactic military in unconventional warfare, they would embed small teams of specialists throughout the fleet. These teams would operate independently, using the tactics Hana had perfected to create chaos behind enemy lines. "The Ravagers expect us to fight the way we always have," Admiral Kazuki explained. "Organized formations, predictable strategies, honor-bound behavior. Instead, they are going to face something they have never encountered before." "Which is what?" asked Vextar. "Humans who refuse to play by anyone's rules," Admiral Kazuki replied grimly. Hana assembled her team from the Academy's top graduates, selecting those who had shown the greatest adaptability during the Crucible. Jiho, who had learned to think like prey instead of a predator. Minyo, who could turn any piece of equipment into a weapon. Soman, who could maintain communications under impossible conditions. Tae, who had abandoned his people's honor codes in favor of effectiveness. They were given the best equipment the Academy could provide, but Hana knew that equipment would not win this war. Victory would come from the willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive, no matter how brutal or dishonorable it might seem. As they prepared to deploy to the front lines, Vextar approached Hana one final time. The massive Saurid instructor, who had once mocked her small size and quiet demeanor, now looked at her with the deep respect reserved for proven warriors. "Those scars you showed us on the first day," he said quietly. "They were just the beginning, were they not?" Hana looked out through the transport bay windows at the stars, where distant flashes of light already marked the opening battles of the invasion. "Every war leaves marks. This one will leave more, and if we lose?" For the first time since entering the Academy, Hana smiled. It was not a warm expression, but rather the cold confidence of someone who had faced extinction and survived through pure stubbornness. "We will not lose. We might not win the way anyone expects, but we will not lose." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I have seen what happens when humans are pushed too far. I have watched us do impossible things when everything else has failed." She turned to face him directly. "The Ravagers think they know what they are facing. They have conquered other species by being more ruthless, more brutal, more willing to break the rules than their enemies. And they have never faced humans who have learned to be just as ruthless as they are." The transport ship that would carry them to the front lines was loading supplies and ammunition. Hana watched her team checking their equipment one final time. These young aliens had come to the Academy as naive cadets dreaming of glory and honor. Now they were hardened warriors who understood that survival mattered more than reputation. "Do you think they are ready?" Vextar asked, watching the same scene. "No one is ever ready for their first real war, but they know how to adapt, how to survive, and how to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless." Hana picked up her gear bag and slung it over her shoulder. That will have to be enough. As they boarded the transport, Salman asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What if the Ravagers are too strong? What if there are just too many of them? Hana settled into her seat and began checking her weapons one final time. Then we make them pay for every world they take. We make victory so expensive that they decide it is not worth the cost. And if that does not work, then we keep fighting until there is nothing left to fight with. Then we fight with our bare hands. Then we fight with our teeth. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had already made that choice 17 times. Humans do not surrender. We do not give up. We do not quit. The transport lifted off from the Academy landing pad, carrying its cargo of young warriors toward a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. As they rose through the atmosphere, the lights of the capital city spread out below them like scattered stars. Minho pressed his face against the window, looking down at the peaceful world they were leaving behind. Do you think we will see it again? Some of us will, Hana replied honestly. Others will not. But if we do our job right, the people down there will never have to see what we have seen. They will never have to learn what we have learned. What have we learned? Asked Tay. Hana rolled up her sleeves one final time, revealing the scars that had started everything. That sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to become something that is not innocent. That sometimes the only way to save lives is to be willing to take them. That sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is to become temporarily uncivilized. She looked around at her team, these young faces that had aged years in just a few months of training. The Ravagers are about to learn what happens when you threaten the things that humans care about. And what is that? Jiho asked. We become the monsters that even monsters are afraid of. The transport broke through the atmosphere and entered deep space, where the invasion fleet waited like a dark cloud against the stars. Thousands of Ravager ships, each one representing destruction and death for millions of innocent people. But racing toward them was something the Ravagers had never faced before. A small team of humans and their allies who had learned to fight without rules, to survive without hope, and to win against impossible odds. The drill instructor had asked about her combat history. She had rolled up her sleeves and let the scars speak. Now it was time to make new scars, new stories, new lessons in what happened when humanity refused to accept defeat. The war was coming to the core worlds, but it would find something waiting that no tactical computer could predict or counter. It would find humans who had learned that sometimes the only way to preserve what was good and decent in the universe was to temporarily abandon goodness and decency themselves. And in the cold depths of space, as two vast fleets prepared to clash, a small human woman checked her weapons one more time and prepared to teach the galaxy's greatest predators what it really meant to fight for survival. The real war was about to begin, and humanity was finally ready to fight it. The only way they knew. How, with everything they had, until there was nothing left to give. The end.